So Jewish history is very old. Jewish history begins with Abraham almost 4,000 years ago. Abraham was born in 1948 or 1813 BCE, so almost 4,000 years ago. Moses lived 3,300 years ago. And we Jews have the strongest recorded history and the longest history by far of any nation on earth. We know who lived in each generation, who our leaders were. We could name a major event in just about every single decade in the last 3,000 years. We actually have books of chronology that go through year by year what happened each year, and we can cover 3,000 years, just about every year, or definitely every decade, what happened consistently. Major events in Jewish history. Sometimes people question Jewish history, wonder if, well, are we the real Jews? Are we the ancients? You may have heard anti-Semites claim things like that. What they don't know, well, firstly, they don't really care whether it makes sense or not, usually, right? They're just saying it because they can. But what these people generally don't know is that Jewish history is so well recorded and so widely recorded. We have so much information. We know exactly what happened consistently in every place, in every community, in every year throughout Jewish history. We have a very, very well recorded history. And it's important as Jews that we understand and we study and we know that history. So it's important for us to understand Jewish history, what happened throughout the last 3,000 plus years of Jewish history. But in order to properly understand history, in order to structure our history, it's important to split history into periods. General history is often split into periods. We have a Bronze Age, we have an Iron Age, we have a Classical period, we have a Roman period, we have what we call the Middle Ages, we have the modern period, we have various periods in history, and the only way you can really structure history is by splitting it into periods. So in Jewish history, we also have periods of Jewish history. And it's really important to understand those periods and know those periods of Jewish history. Without knowing the general periods of Jewish history, you really don't understand Jewish history. And someone speaks about a historical event, and you don't know where to put it. You don't know where it belongs. Did that thing happen 300 years ago? Did it happen 3,000 years ago? Makes a big difference, right? 300 is not 3,000. It's 2,700 years apart. So it can be very confusing if you don't have clarity on the periods in Jewish history. So we have classic periods that we use in Jewish history, and each period generally represents a couple hundred years. So, and when we speak of Jewish history, when we speak of an event in Jewish history, when we speak of a historical figure, we will always refer to the period that they lived in, the period of Jewish history when that particular event happened, when that particular person lived. We're talking about a particular period. If you don't know what period we're talking about, Jewish history makes no sense, and you cannot properly understand it. So my goal today is to explain to you the basic periods of Jewish history, what differentiates one period from the next. They're not just different years, but they're very different in the structure, in the type, the way people lived, in, as we'll see, in the development of Judaism. They're very different, and therefore it's important to know every event, which period it is within Jewish history. Now, Judaism is centered around Torah. Jewish history, by extension, is centered around Torah. Almost all Jewish leaders, when we go back in Jewish history, almost all Jewish leaders were scholars. And their leadership role was synonymous with being a Jewish scholar. It was a scholarly leadership role. Important events, if you open any Jewish history book, most important events and most important contributions to Judaism are often related to Torah scholarship. So it's all revolves around the Torah. The Jewish people would not be a people without the Torah. Rav Saadia Gaon coined the term that our nation is not a nation without the Torah. And Jewish history would not be a history without the Torah. All of our heroes in Jewish history are all just about all Torah scholars, right? They're all Jewish. They're all scholarly leaders. They were all connected to Torah in one way or another. If you go to Israel, you'll see, this is just a side note, you go to Israel and you look at their sports teams. And there's something funny about Israeli sports teams. Almost every team in Israel is either called Maccabi or Beitar. Why is that? Because it's Maccabi from this city and Maccabi from that city and Beitar from this city and Beitar from that city, because the people who started the Israeli sports teams were mostly secularists, secular Jews who did not want to have any religious leaders or religious scholars or religious events as their heroes. They wanted to name their teams after major heroes in Jewish history, but they were short. They came up short, very hard to find. So they came up with Beitar, which is the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and Maccabi, which is the Maccabees of Hanukkah. But other than that, there really aren't too many non-religious or not religiously connected heroes in Jewish history. You'll be very hard-pressed to find that. For the Jewish secularist who's trying to find a secular history, it almost doesn't exist. Your history is just a couple pages. So Jewish history is almost all revolves around Torah. So important events, important contributions are always related to Torah scholarship. So the story of Jewish history is then synonymous with the development of Torah scholarship. And unfortunately, there were some historians that did not understand this and therefore totally misunderstood Jewish history. The only way to study Jewish history is in the context of the development of Torah scholarship. So the major periods in Jewish history are also periods of Jewish scholarship. And what differentiates one period from the next is not only where we lived and how we lived, but is also major changes to Jewish scholarship. And these periods, because there's major changes to Jewish scholarship, they're important not just for understanding Jewish history, but also for understanding the evolution of Jewish scholarship, or to understand halacha, Jewish law, as it is today. Now, as a rule, scholars, historians, almost never agree on anything. So, as a rule, even when speaking of periods in history or periods in Jewish history, scholars almost never agree on exactly what the periods are. We're going to cover today 6 general periods that are mostly universally accepted as the periods of Jewish history, although some might add a few here and there, split some of these. The scholars also strongly disagree about when each period ends and the next period begins. And that's because, periods don't just end, one day this period ends and then the next day it begins. So it's a gradual process, right? Periods in history can take decades or hundreds of years to evolve. So because of that gradual process, it's often hard to define what made the new period a new period. Which major events would you say are the moment that creates it a new period? Should we just round it off to the nearest century? You could use Jewish centuries in the Jewish counting. You could use Gregorian centuries in the Gregorian calendar. That's the calendar that we all are familiar with. You could use major events to mark a new history. It's very hard to mark exactly when a history begins and when a history ends. So we don't have definitive details as to, or definitive rules as to a new period in history. But in Jewish history, there's 2 important details that seem to always stand out in marking new periods, what we define as periods. Firstly, as we said, Jewish history revolves around Torah scholarship. So each new period is then associated with a major change in Jewish scholarship or how the Torah was studied and taught. So there were some major changes that led to a new period in Jewish history. Jews also moved around a lot. So periods tend to involve major changes to Jewish communities, where Jews lived and how they lived. Often there's a huge migration where essentially Jews are all mostly in these places and then they move to those places. And those huge migrations are usually also mark the ends or the changes of a period in history, right? Now, these periods we mentioned, they are important for Jewish law. They mark major changes in Jewish law. And they also have importance in how we understand Jewish law. As a rule, Jewish scholars never wanted to disagree with accepted rulings, halachic rulings that is, from an earlier period. So once there was a consensus reached in an earlier period, scholars would not generally disagree with a scholar with consensuses reached in earlier periods. They would disagree with contemporaries or even with someone who lived 100 years or 200 years before them, so long as they weren't from a totally different period. Once that we're dealing with a new period, generally as a rule, Jewish scholars were hesitant to disagree with scholars from an earlier period, and in fact they would challenge colleagues that would disagree with a consensus reached in an earlier period. So the periods really also matter a lot in deciding halacha, in deciding Jewish law, and in the evolution of the Torah. Now, we pointed out that the periods don't end suddenly. It's not that one day this period ends, and then the next day the period, new period comes. But the periods evolve very, very slowly. People live during the time when you're kind of moving from one period to the next, which could be the evolution of the period from one period to a second period could be 100, 200 years, as we'll see. It doesn't happen one day, it doesn't happen 1 year, it doesn't happen one moment. It could happen over multiple generations. So they don't know that they're in a time of period changing. It's often hard to know that until afterwards. It's only noticed after significant time because history is very slow-moving events, or history is a series of events that lead to a story. But the stories of history only happen over time, especially when you're looking at broad views of history, such as periods of history. You're looking at major changes that happen gradually over a lot of time. Often years, decades, sometimes centuries could kind of be part of one history or part of another. So while the primary periods of history that we're going to cover are, as we said, pretty much universally accepted, there's some debate as to when each period starts, each period ends. Every historian, every scholar will give you a different date for the beginning and end and each period. Also, many of the periods we're going to cover can be split into sub-periods and often are split into sub-periods. And often people will say there's not 6, there's 8, there's 10, depending on how you split these periods further. We're not going to cover all those sub-periods today. We have limited time, and I'm going to try to give you an overview of Jewish history today. So we're going to cover 3,000 years in about 45 minutes or so. So we're going to try to do this. We'll just give you the 6 general periods. So let's start. The first period is the biblical period. The first period starts from the beginning of the biblical era, which can either be counted with the creation of Adam in the book of Genesis, or usually it's counted or it could be counted with the birth of Abraham, 1948 or 1813 BCE, 1948 in the Jewish calendar, 1813 BCE in the Gregorian calendar. Or if we fast forward another 500 years, 2448 or 1313 BCE would be the year of the Exodus from Egypt. That's when Israel really first became a nation. That's when we stood at Sinai and received the Torah. So that's really probably the best time we can mark the official beginning of Judaism. It began when we came out of Egypt. Although there is, of course, a prelude to that history. And it began with Moses and with the giving of the Torah. Now we had 613 commandments that we had to fulfill. They travel through the desert for 40 years, and 40 years later, Moses dies, and they enter the promised land, the land of Israel. Then it was called the land of Canaan, led by Joshua, Moses' successor. They conquer the land of Israel. They divide it among the 12 tribes. Every Jewish family gets their own plot of land to farm in the land of Israel, and they're living now in a kind of agrarian period in the land of Israel. This sub-period of the biblical period is known as the period of judges, shoftim, who essentially lead a federation. There are various individuals who are chosen to lead a federation of tribes over the next 400 years or so. After that period, Israel is finally united by the prophet Samuel, who unites them as a kind of a single leader, leading all the tribes, and he appoints the first king Saul, who is followed by the second king, his son-in-law David, who is followed by Solomon. Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem. David chose Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem that stood for 410 years, but it was then destroyed and by the Babylonians, the siege of which we're going to mark on Friday, the 10th of Tevet. And they destroy the temple, and then all of the Jews in Israel are all taken to exile, are all taken as part of a policy of the Babylonian Empire to exile all the captured people, to get them to assimilate into a single Aramaic-speaking Babylonian nation. So all the Jews are exiled throughout the Babylonian Empire, but mostly to Babylon itself, Babylonia, which is modern-day Iraq, Mesopotamia, is the academic name. So they live now mostly in Babylon across the Babylonian Empire. This is already the beginning of a Jewish diaspora. So this period ends when some Jews return to Israel and rebuild the second temple. The final decades of this period is in the land of Israel. The Jews are led by what's called the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the Great Assembly, which is led by Ezra. We've done a class both about the Knesset HaGedolah, the Great Assembly, as well as Ezra. They made some major contributions to Judaism. Notably, they canonized the Tanakh, the holy works of our scripture. They set them, which are the 24 books of our holy scriptures. We have, of course, the 5 books of the Torah, but they added another 19 books, which they considered holy. They also set up the entire system of prayers and blessings. Before that, there was no synagogue, no prayers, no blessings, no structure for prayer, and all of that was created by the men of the Great Assembly. This period, the biblical period, the end year is usually given as 1312 BC. Why? That is the year, according to the Jewish tradition, that Alexander defeated, the Macedonian emperor Alexander defeated the Persian Empire. This gave
1312 or 312?
312. Okay. This gave rise to various, I misspoke, 312. This gave rise to various Greek kingdoms in the Middle East and the rise of the Hellenist culture, Greek culture, throughout the Middle East. It is also, according to our tradition, the year that Ezra died and the Great Assembly was disbanded. So during this period that lasts from Moses till Ezra, it's a period of 1,000 years. This is a period where Jews are guided by the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the oral Torah, which is taught from generation to generation. It is a period where the books of Tanakh are slowly written, but are not finalized. There's no official standard version. There's no rules as to which books are considered holy and which books are not. Just many different books, history books, books of prophecy that people have that are out there. Throughout this period, Jews are led by prophets, Nevi'im, who guide the people during this entire period. At the end of this period, prophecy ends. Following 312 BC, we don't know of any other Jewish prophets after that. So with this, prophecy ends. So this period ends with a number of, this 1,000-year period ends with a number of major changes. And this is the thing we're going to keep seeing. Each period is going to end with major changes that usher in a new period. Firstly, Jews no longer all live in the land of Israel, but as a result of the destruction of the first temple and the exile, are now spread throughout the ancient world, throughout what had been the Persian Empire, as far east as Afghanistan and India, as far west as Greece, North Africa. So Jews are spread out. The largest Jewish community now is still in Babylonia. There's still also a sizable, and the center of Judaism is in Israel, where the second temple is built, but Jews no longer live in exclusively in the land, or almost exclusive land of Israel. Another important change, Jews no longer speak Hebrew as a spoken language. As a result of living in Babylonia, where in the Babylonian Empire you were only allowed to speak one language, Aramaic, as part of the assimilation policy of the Babylonian Empire, Jews no longer spoke Hebrew. They read Hebrew and understood Hebrew because it was the book of their Torah, but they did not speak Hebrew. It wasn't the language they spoke at home. They all spoke Aramaic. Another thing that happens at the end of this period is the Tanakh is finalized. Before that, the only official works, holy works that we had was the 5 books of Moses itself. But there were no other official holy works. Now the Tanakh is edited by the men of the Great Assembly. There is now an official version of the 24 books of our Holy Scripture. They've now added 19 holy books that is not Torah, but considered holy. Another major change, prophecy ends. There's no more prophets. God is not directly communicating with us anymore. And also there are many innovations to Judaism, notably the prayer, the synagogue, the blessings, all brought by the men of the Great Assembly. And so there are all these major changes that have happened now in Judaism, and this ushers in the next period known as the Tanaic period. Tanai means teachers. It's a period of teachers of the oral tradition. The oral tradition is still not written down, the oral Torah. We did a class on the oral Torah a few months ago. The oral Torah at this time is still not written down. It's being taught by Tanaim, by teachers. This is a period that began with the Greek conquest of the land, a few years after, of the land of Israel and really of the whole Persian Empire, a few years after the Second Temple was built. It's a time of Greek and Roman influence in Israel and really around the Mediterranean. It's also a time of the development of our oral tradition. Our oral tradition becomes had been around since Moses, but it becomes much more structured and organized. They begin to organize the oral tradition by topic. It's also a time of clashes with Greek and Roman cultures. And there's a rise of breakaway sects, some of which end up becoming their own religion, such as Christianity. So the beginning of this period is under Israel itself, the land of Israel is under the Ptolemy Greek rule. Babylon is under a different Greek rule. Jews in Turkey, Syria are under Seleucid Greek rules. But the Jews in Israel itself are under the Ptolemies. Later, the Seleucids conquer Israel and try to force Greek culture on the Jews in Israel, which leads to the Hanukkah rebellion in about 139 BCE. This is also a period known as the period following the Hanukkah rebellion, is the period, or about when the Seleucids took control of the land of Israel, is a period known as the Zugot, the pairs, because during this period, the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council of Judaism, was not led by a single president, but by pairs, a president and essentially a vice president. There would be 2 leaders. That's known as the period of Zugot. Eventually, the Romans gain control of Israel. The Roman Empire is growing during this period. They eventually defeat the Seleucids and eventually defeat the Ptolemies as well and all the other Greek empires. Babylonia itself falls under Parthian rule during this period. The Jews in the East are all under, which is the largest Jewish community still, are all under Parthian rule. Herod becomes king under the Romans. Herod dies around the year 0, and that's when Judea, Israel, becomes a province of the Roman Empire. At this point, many scholars arose, and there's a lot of development of the oral tradition. And this is really when scholars begin to debate different questions in the oral tradition. The Sanhedrin was less effective. It was a time of turbulence, and things were not resolved as easily. Debates were not resolved so easily because it required the Sanhedrin to meet and resolve it. And so these scholars become known as Tanaim, or teachers. Around the year 70, the Second Temple is destroyed. The Jewish center moves to a nearby town of Yavne, where there had already been a great school. Some 60 years later, around the year 130, there is a second rebellion, and the center of Judaism moves to the Galilee because Judea is devastated. The southern Israel, which is now known as Judea, is devastated due to the wars. And so most Jews are now living in northern Israel. The center of Jewish scholarship is in northern Israel. In the late 100s, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi leads a large team of scholars to write the laws of the oral tradition, the first work of our oral tradition called the Mishnah. I did a class on the Mishnah a couple months ago. So many of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's students wrote their own works on the oral tradition in works that are generally classified as Braita or Midrash. So following Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's death around the year 200, Roman persecution increased in the land of Israel. Many of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's greatest students, including Abba Arichta, known as Rav, and Shmuel, leave Israel. They're both from Babylon. They go back to Babylon, which at the time is under Parthian rule. The Parthians are very tolerant of Jews, as opposed to the Romans. And as a result of the persecution, Babylon quickly eclipsed Israel as the center of Torah learning and the largest Jewish, with the dwindling of the Jewish community in Israel, Babylon becomes by far the largest community once again. So this period, the period of Tanaim, of the teachers, once again, which ends around the year 200, once again ends with some major changes. Firstly, for the first time now in over some 1,500 years from the beginning of Judaism, there's now an official work of Jewish law, the Mishnah. That's the official work that had been put together by a large team of scholars led by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who was the president of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council of Judaism. They put together this work, the primary work of Jewish law. Much of the oral tradition was written down in other books, in the Braitas, in the Midrashim. Much of the oral tradition is now written down. In addition, the center of Jewish life is now moving from Israel, where it had been throughout the Second Temple period, to Babylonia due to Roman persecution in Israel. Babylonia is outside of Roman reach under Parthian rule. With the center of Jewish life moving, one other major change happens, although this doesn't happen until the mid-300s, smicha, rabbinic ordination, which had been passed down from Moses. Moses had ordained Joshua, his disciple, and rabbinic ordination had been passed down from generation to generation. But it can only be given in the land of Israel. Once scholarship in the land of Israel dwindles, smicha slowly ends. There's no scholars in the land of Israel to give smicha to. As a result, you can only have people with rabbis with smicha, who are ordained, sitting on the Sanhedrin, sitting on the Supreme Council. Without ordained rabbis, the Supreme Council is disbanded. And in the early 300s, as a result, the Supreme Council of Judaism is disbanded. We have no more Supreme Council of Judaism. From now on, Jewish rules, no new Jewish laws can be made, and any rules that are made by consensus. Our calendar has to be restructured. We'll talk about the calendar. We have a class in a few weeks about the calendar, but the calendar, which had been created by the Sanhedrin on a regular basis, now has to be set in place. A lot of changes happen as a result. We once did a class on the Sanhedrin, spoke about how it disbanded. We also once did a class on smicha, the original ordination. Today, while people call themselves rabbis, they're not the real rabbis. We don't have the real smicha anymore. We don't have the real ordination anymore. And we once did a class where we explained what happened to it and what the role of the rabbis are today. But more relevant for us, this period around the year 200 comes these major changes. The oral Torah has now been written down in these major works. The Jewish center has moved due to persecution from Israel to Babylon, and over time, smicha is discontinued, and as a result, the Sanhedrin is disbanded. Any questions on these two periods? So we're now up to the third period, which is the Amoraic, or the period of the Amoraim. Tanaim, the second period, means teachers. Amoraim means sayers. The Amoraim, called the teachers from the earlier period, the scholars of the earlier period, they call themselves teachers. They are our teachers. We are just sayers. We don't teach, we just say. They put themselves down. So they refer to themselves as sayers, and therefore they're referred to by us today still as the Amoraim, and the period is known as the Amoraic period. Sometimes it's referred to as the Talmudic period. So during this period, in the early part of this period, there's still some Jewish scholarship in Israel. There's still a Sanhedrin. It lasts till the mid 300s. In the early 300s, Rome adopts Christianity. Once Rome is Christian, life, as bad as it had been for Jews in the Roman Empire, gets much, 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 much worse, especially in the land of Israel, which is now the Holy Land for Christians. And so Jews really, really suffer in the land of Israel, and the Jewish community in the land of Israel, as a result, really dwindles. Meanwhile, Jewish life in Babylon grows. Jews are very successful under Parthian rule. The Parthians essentially give Jews autonomy, let them rule themselves. They have their own prince, Reish Gelutah he's called, who rules the Babylonian Jewish community as essentially an autonomous state with his own militia, with their own laws, their own courts. And Jews are kind of living all around Babylon. In many areas, they're even a majority in Babylon. And Jewish scholarship at this time is centered around two major schools, Sura and Naharda'ah, two major schools in Babylon. Later, Naharda'ah is destroyed in the mid-200s, and the center moves to Pumbedita. So Sura and Pumbedita become the two main schools in Babylon, the two major yeshivas. And it's in these schools where the Talmudic method is developed to study and analyze the Mishnah, the Braitas, the works of our oral tradition. And so over the years, these great schools, many scholars study in these schools. They're very, very large. And over the generations, the analysis of the Mishnah and Braitas is passed on from generation to generation. It evolves and it develops. In the early 400s, now there are Jews living in the Roman Empire and throughout the rest of the Jewish world during this period, but the vast majority of Jews are living in Babylonia. And that becomes the undisputed Jewish center of Jewish life and Jewish scholarship. In the early 400s, Rav Ashi led the scholars of Masa Machsia, which was a suburb of Sura, where the yeshiva of Sura was, to compile the discussions that they had in the school into a work that would become known as the Gemara, or the Babylonian Talmud. This work is a monumentous work, the most important work of Judaism. It is the most comprehensive work of Judaism. It is huge. The work today is made up of 2,700 double-sided pages. So it's a very, very large work, very complex and deep, and it was completed it took decades to complete the Talmud, and it was completed around the year 500. Eventually, the Talmud would become the undisputed halachic authority, accepted as final by all Jews, as the undisputed halachic, comprehensive halachic work. The Babylonian Talmud. There is another Talmud, but the Babylonian Talmud. We did a class a little while back about the Talmud as well. I know we're covering a lot of other topics as we cover the whole Jewish history. So, following the completion of the Talmud in the early 500s, after some time of mostly living peacefully, thriving for really hundreds of years under Parthian rule in Babylonia, in the early 500s, there was a lot of persecution of the Jews under the Persians. Throughout the Persia, it was now a Persian Empire, but throughout the Persian Empire, particularly in Babylonia, which was the main Jewish center, there was a lot of persecution of Jews. As a result, it led to the closing of the big yeshivas and opening of smaller yeshivas in other towns. During this period, this kind of end of the Amoraic period, the scholars became known as Svuraim, and these scholars continued to edit and add to the Talmud. Although the Talmud was largely completed around the year 500, the scholars continued to edit and add to the Talmud for the next 100 years or so. In 589, the yeshiva of Pumbedita reopened, marking the beginning of what we call the period of Gaonim. it ended a period of persecution for Jews, not entirely, but it marked the beginning of an end of a period of persecution for Jews. The yeshiva of Suras opened soon after, and it marked the beginning, the resurgence of the two great yeshivas, two great schools in Babylonia. In 634, the Arabs conquered Babylon, the Muslims. And soon after, they defeated the entire Persian Empire, soon attacking the Byzantine Empire, capturing the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, including the land of Israel, and then moving through North Africa to conquer Egypt, eventually make it to Morocco, and even north to Spain. So this would change Jewish life in Babylon and around the world. So the Amoraic period ends with firstly a new monumental work, the Babylonian Talmud, which is the final work of Jewish law, final word of Jewish law, and becomes essentially the source of all Jewish scholarship after that, the primary source. It also, with the Arab conquest, or really with the persecution toward the end of the Persian Empire, it really is the end of the strong Jewish autonomy for the Jewish community in Babylon, the wealth and success of Jews in Babylon. It is also the rise of Jews, once again, the rise of Jews within the Arab Caliphate that has now risen, where Babylon is now part of. We see now Jews who until now had mostly been agrarian. Both in the land of Israel, most Jews were farmers, and in Babylon, most Jews had been farmers. Now we see, now Jews start moving away from the land. It's not clear if the Arabs pushed them off the land or they did so on their own with great Arab centers, cities building, and the Arabs were became very, very urban very quickly, building big cities like Baghdad in Babylonia. But Jews very quickly began moving to the big cities, moving away from the towns, moving away from the villages, and the Jews became more urbanized. They're going to stay that way. Since then, they never went back to the villages and to the farms. It's also a time when, following the Arab conquerors, Jews follow the Arabs, and they build Jewish communities across the Caliphate, both eastward into Persia, where there already and further east, where there already were Jewish communities, as well as westward, building new Jewish communities in the land of Israel, or increasing the existing communities in Egypt, throughout North Africa, and even in Spain. It is a time when the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, and all these communities I should mention, throughout the Caliphate, throughout the Arab Caliphate, which stretches from India all the way to Morocco, this massive caliphate, this massive empire, all the Jews throughout this empire are all politically and culturally linked to the main Jewish center in Babylon. They're in the same country, essentially, in the same empire. They're politically linked and they're culturally linked. And during this period, Jews in the Middle East and North Africa stopped speaking Aramaic, which had always been the spoken Jewish language since the destruction of the first temple and the first exile to Babylonia. Now they begin speaking Arabic, at least those in the Arabic Caliphate. So this, around the year 600, again, there's a couple events. There's the end of the Talmud that ends in 500, beginning of persecution in the Persian Empire around 500, the reinstating of the yeshivas in 589, the Arab conquest in 634. Again, this is something that takes 150 years, but we have to put a year, we put around 600, but slowly there's a change from the Amoraic period to the next period, the Gaonic period. Any questions?
You know that everything has a name. Okay, this name and that name. Where did the names come from?
So the biblical period, it comes from the Torah Tanakh. The Tanakh, the Bible. The Tanaic period, we said the Amoraim called the Tanaim, they called them teachers. They called themselves sayers. That's where those names came from. We'll see as we go through each period where it came from. Annette? Can I trouble you to get me some water? Can you get me some water? So following the Amoraic period, we then have the Gaonic period, or the Gaonim. The Gaonim live in what's once again a much prosperous time for Jews within the Arab Caliphate, and for Jewish communities. Jewish communities now are much more spread out. There had always been Jewish communities in other places, but they were much smaller. Now there were larger Jewish communities in the Middle East, North Africa, Persia. Many of these communities prosper. Scholars are all, but there's only one center of Jewish scholarship, Babylonia. So scholars are all trained in Babylonia. Every rabbi, wherever you were, whether you're in Spain or North Africa or Italy, wherever you may be during this period, or in Byzantine, which today is Turkey, wherever Jews lived, their rabbis were trained in Babylon. And there's a huge amount of communication during this period between the yeshivas in Babylon and their leaders. The leaders of the yeshivas in Babylon became known as the Gaonim. They became known as the Gaonim because the yeshivas themselves were known as Yeshivat Gaon Yaakov, the school, the yeshiva of the pride of Jacob. Gaon means pride. And so the leaders of the yeshiva became known as the Gaonim, the Gaon, the pride of the school. And so that became the title of the leader. Today in modern Hebrew and later Hebrew, the word Gaon became the term for genius because the leaders were geniuses. But it was originally from Gaon meant pride, Jewish pride. It was the pride of Israel, was a pride of Jacob, was each yeshiva. So this became known as the Gaonic period. And so there's a huge amount of communication between the yeshivas in Babylon and the Gaonim and other Jewish communities around the world during this time. The communities, even in the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine as we call it today, and the disintegrating Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire, during this period, Rome had already split east-west into Eastern and Western Roman empires. And by the 600s, the Western Roman Empire was already disintegrating and falling apart. Rome had been sacked already multiple times. And so there were Jews living both in Byzantine, modern-day Turkey, Greece, as well as in Italy and southern France. And Jews during this time were also connected to Babylonia. They also saw Babylon as their center. And so while Jews throughout the Arab world spoke Arabic, no longer Aramaic, Jews throughout in the Byzantine Empire spoke Greek, or a Jewish version of Greek, Romanite, and Jews in the Western Roman Empire spoke a Jewish Latin, or known as Laz. But their scholars all knew Arabic. Arabic was the language of scholarship at the time during this period. In general, of all scholarship, especially of Jewish scholarship, any rabbi, even if they were living in Italy or in Greece or in what today would be Turkey, had been trained in Babylon. So they spoke Arabic, and Arabic was the language of Jews. It was a time also scholars began writing books on Jewish law. Before that, we had a couple of major works of compilations of the oral tradition or the analysis in the Talmud, but there had never been individual books written by people. Here, individual Gaonim, leaders in Babylon, wrote various books of Jewish law that they could send to these communities that would then have a resource they can use to have the laws. So we have a number of books of Jewish law appear during this time. Also, it's a time the spreading of Jewish life requires codification of many parts of Judaism. So such as the first published Sidurim are found during this period, the first published prayer books. The rise of philosophy throughout the world, throughout the Arabic world at the time, also leads to Jewish scholars developing Jewish philosophy. While Jewish philosophy had existed prior to that, it had never existed as an official kind of its own subject, and there were never books on Jewish philosophy. Now we start seeing books on Jewish philosophy as well. So as well, in addition, as we mentioned, there's a lot of communication back and forth. There are tens of thousands of letters written during this period between the schools in Babylon, the leaders of the schools in Babylon, and their various students who are leading communities around the Jewish world. And a significant number of these letters, thousands of these letters, have survived. And we have records, not the originals mostly, but we have records of thousands of these letters today. So this period ends though around the year 1000. With this, as the Arab Caliphate begins to disintegrate, the Arab Caliphate already begins to disintegrate in the 700s, but then it starts disintegrating further, in which, though for a long time there was officially a caliphate, an empire, in reality, each local leader, each local governor essentially ruled their own kingdom. Essentially ruled their own land. There were rebellions. There were individual leaders that declared themselves the caliph, that declared themselves the leader. So essentially there was no single Arab caliphate. It also is a time, the end of the Gaonic period is the beginning of the decline of Arab culture and success. With the decline of the caliphate comes a decline in Arab culture. And Arab culture is no longer, it's going to slowly decline over a couple hundred years until it moves pretty backwards. During this period, as the caliphate is dwindling, so is the Jewish community in Babylon. And Jews in Babylon face more and more persecution under Arab rule, and as a result, in the early 1000s, the yeshivas in Babylon are closed. But with the dwindling of the Jewish community in Babylon, Jews are moving elsewhere. They're moving to other places. And that leads to the establishment of yeshivas and schools in other places. And each place essentially, instead of there being a single center for Jewish life in Babylonia, now there is centers for Jewish life in other places, particularly in Spain and in Central Europe, Germany, France. One particular event that led to this big change in periods is an event known as the Arba Shvoyim, or the Four Captives. We don't know the exact year. We think it's about the mid-900s, when four Rosh Yeshiva, leaders of the schools from Babylon, were on a fundraising trip. Remember, these schools in Babylon were supported by Jews around the world, would pay for them. So they were on a fundraising trip, and they were sailing in the Mediterranean, and they were captured by pirates. The pirates recognized the value of their catch. And so what they did is they sold each of these four rabbis to a different Jewish community. One was sold in Tunisia, one was sold to Rome, one was sold to Cordoba, Spain. We don't know where the fourth one ended up. As a result, the communities purchased the freedom of these rabbis, but on each one on condition that the rabbis remained with the community. And so the rabbis remained, and each one opened a yeshiva in their place, which led to these lots of yeshivas opening in different places. And as a result, there's schools now that rival in Europe, in North Africa, that rival the schools in Babylon. So at the end of this period, which ends around the year 1000, but again, it's something that took about 150 years, starting around 900, or even earlier, with the disintegration of the Arab Caliphate, and it gradually happens and really ends with the closing of the Babylonian schools in 1040, 1038. So it's really a gradual decline, gradual evolution. But at the end of this period, Babylon is losing its role as the largest and central Jewish community. Persecution in Babylon is increasing. Eventually, the major schools, the yeshivas that are the center of Jewish life around the world, close. Judaism is becoming increasingly decentralized, while the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council, had been disbanded much, much earlier in the early Amoraic period, but now at least it had been centered in one place in two major schools. Now, now Judaism is becoming less centralized. Each Jewish community is essentially becoming independent. Variations are therefore growing between these different communities, which would lead to variations such as Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Jewish communities in Christian Europe, as Jews are fleeing Babylon, Jewish communities in Christian Europe see a resurgence. They see growth. Many Jews during this time, Northern Europe is just beginning to be settled after Charlemagne, and and the creation of France as a state and various German states. The Rhine Valley is being settled. Jews are moving up from Byzantine, and which is Greece, Turkey today, and Italy and southern France are moving up to northern France and Germany in large numbers. Jews from Babylonia are moving there as well. But the Jews in these places, they don't speak Arabic or even Jewish Latin. They're speaking Jewish French, and then they end up mostly speaking a Jewish German, which eventually becomes Yiddish, right? Jews in Spain, though, in North Africa, they're still speaking, at least in the early part, at this time, are still speaking Arabic as their main language. But there's no longer a universal Jewish language, right? Later, Spain's going to be conquered by the Spanish, by the Christians, and Jews in Spain will stop speaking Arabic. And then there really won't be a universal Jewish language that all Jewish scholars at least speak, other than Hebrew. So Hebrew is going to become the language of Jewish scholarship. There's also a decentralization of Jewish life. So as a result, scholarship is not about, you don't go to a school, study for 10, 15 years, know everything there is to know, and then go back home and now you know it all. But rather, because there's this decentralization, right? Each school's teaching something else, slightly different, the same Torah, but slightly different. So there's more and more books. People are writing books, writing commentaries, writing books of law. So there's more and more books are being written. And so as a result, there's this explosion in books, in Jewish books of Jewish scholarship written on all sorts of topics. It also marks, while there had been persecution in various times until now, but it marks really a period of sustained Muslim and Christian persecution. Jews are now living under Muslim and Christian rule, and there's sustained persecution that really is ongoing and is going to last for close to 1,000 years. With almost no break, there's very few kind of good periods for the next 1,000 years for Jews. Any questions? Yes, Susan.
So who was it that was persecuting the Babylonian Jews?
Originally the Persians in around 500 to the 500s, but then later in the late 900s and 1000s, it's the Arabs.
Yeah.
They're the ones that closed the yeshivas. They're the ones that killed Rav Hai Gaon, the last of the Gaonim. They made life difficult for Jews, limiting, Jewish occupation, limiting what Jews could do, made life hard. Jews went to seek their fortune elsewhere.
You know what's amazing is how nations that persecuted the Jews later on welcomed them back.
That does happen a lot. Yes, very good point. That nations that persecute the Jews later welcome them back. So the next period that starts around the year 1000, but really 900 to 1050, if we want to give it a broader kind of transition, is known as the Rishonim, the first ones. Why are they called the first ones? They're going to be called the first ones compared to the next period that we call the Achronim, the later ones. It opens in the 900s with the growth of the communities in North Africa. North Africa, particularly Tunisia, was a major Jewish community at the time, and Morocco, Spain, and France and Germany. In 1038, the last major yeshiva in Babylon closes, really bring the period of the Gaonim to a close. But meanwhile, in the Arabic North Africa and Spain, and Arabic Spain, and in Christian France and Germanic states, there's these new Jewish centers. The large Jewish communities of Mainz, Worms, and Spira, three big Jewish communities on the Rhine, merged together into a federation, which essentially becomes a federation for a period of kind of the main Jewish communities of Germany during this period, and they host a large yeshiva, large schools. Rashi, who lives in Troyes in France, becomes the leader of a yeshiva in France, and he has many, many students who themselves develop a new style of analysis, of scholarship analysis known as they become known as the Tosfot. And they would build France and Germany. Many of them opened their own schools all across France and Germany, and they built it into a major Torah center. But there's also a time when Christian Europe is rocked by pogroms. Constantly, Jews are attacked. particularly in 1096. The Crusaders, the First Crusade, wipes out many major Jewish communities throughout the Rhine Valley. In Arab North Africa and Spain, there's also a huge rise of schools, Jewish scholarship in both North Africa and Spain. It ends in the middle 1100s with the rise of a group called the Almohads. The Almohads were an extremist Muslim group who would kill all non-Muslims unless they converted to Islam. And so Jews were forced to flee North Africa and Spain. And at this time, this is already the beginning of the Reconquista, when the Christians were moving back into Spain. And so most Jews moved to northern Spain, Christian northern Spain, Aragon, Castile, which were now centered in northern Spain. And they became the great centers of Jewish life in Spain. Maimonides is born during this period in the mid-1100s, and as a result of in Cordoba, but as a result of the Almohad invasion of Spain, he flees to Egypt, and he becomes then Egypt. At the time, there was a very small Jewish community, but from there, his writings, his teachings influenced the entire Jewish world. In the mid-1300s, the Black Death spreads across Europe and destroys Jewish communities, pogroms as a result of the Black Death, because of course Jews were held responsible, led to the decimation of many Jewish communities across all of Europe. In the early 1300s, Jews are expelled from France. They're soon let back in, but in the late 1300s, they're expelled a second time. Jews are also expelled a little earlier than that from England. In 1391, there are pogroms across Spain that led to many forced conversions. And so you have many of these new Christians, Jews who had been forcibly converted to Christianity. And around this time, also in the mid-1300s, there's a new kingdom in the east. The Slavic kingdom of Poland is growing, expanding, and begins inviting Jews to develop the vast lands of their kingdom. So by 1500, most European Jews have fled from France, where they've been expelled, in England, in Germany, where they're really suffering, and they've moved to what was now the vast Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that covered most of Eastern Europe. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, putting an end to the Byzantine Empire, and I guess the end of the 1500-year Roman Empire, and the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, an empire that would be, at least initially, very welcoming to Jews. In 1492, Jews were expelled from Spain, and then 4 years later from Portugal. Those Jews settled in North Africa, in Italy, throughout the newly created Ottoman Empire, and eventually in Western Europe. Another major thing that happens at the very end of this period, around 1440, the printing press is invented. By 1474, the first Hebrew book was printed. By 1500, dozens of Hebrew books had been printed. Now books are widely available. You don't have to copy manuscripts by hand, spending months copying a manuscript. You could just go to the bookseller and buy a book. It was that easy. You could get books. Someone can publish something and everyone has access to it. Ideas and teachings can spread quickly. So at the end of this period, which, again, the period ends slowly like all periods. It ends between around the mid-1300s, or about 1350 to 1500. There's all these major events. The huge migration of Jews there's a huge migration of Jews from Germany to Eastern Europe. The vast majority of Jews have moved from Germany to Eastern Europe. There's the expulsion of Jews from France, the expulsion of Jews 100 years later from Spain, and the creation of the Ottoman Empire. So now, instead of most Jews living in Spain and Germany, most Jews are now living in the Ottoman Empire, and which is essentially around the Mediterranean, and in Poland, the Kingdom of Poland, which, by the way, the Kingdom of Poland and the Ottoman Empire were at war with each other, and they bordered each other at that time, because the southern Eastern Europe was part of the Ottoman Empire, northern Eastern Europe was all part of the Polish Kingdom. So Jews were now more spread out than they had ever been. They were spread really all over. They had spread far and wide as a result of all this persecution. Printing also made books available in ways that they had never been before, allowed for teachings to quickly spread, for ideas to become widely accepted very quickly. There were also a number of important halachic works that were written during this period that became the basis of Jewish law and became essentially classics of Jewish law, notably the Arba Turim, which was written in the mid 1300s by Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher, and the Bet Yosef and Shulchan Aruch written by Rav Yosef Karo, with the commentaries of the Darkei Moshe and the Mappa written by Rav Moshe Israelis of Poland. So these became major works and major halachic works codifying Jewish law. So this all happens at the end of this period. Again, periods change gradually. We put 1500 as a final date, but it's really goes from about 1350 to 1500. It's a gradual change. You could even put it all the way through to mid 1500s. Any questions? So that period was known as the Rishonim. The next period we call the Achronim. Rishonim means the first ones. Achronim means the later ones. So to divide these two periods. The period of the Achronim is a period that sees this explosion of Jewish scholarship because now printing is widely available. There's also improved communication. Communication is really easy. There's improved roads, there's improved mail during this period. It's the kind of the early modern period, and so communication becomes easy. For much of this period, the largest Jewish communities were in Eastern Europe, which originally was the Kingdom of Poland, but then in the 18th century, the Kingdom of Poland disintegrates and is split between Prussia, the Austrian Empire, and the Russian Empire. Most Jews end up in the Russian Empire, where they were confined to a pale of settlement. The other major center for Jewish life was in the Ottoman Empire, which includes both modern day the Balkans, what was until recently Yugoslavia, Greece, Turkey itself today, Syria, Iraq, Israel, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia. All of these kind of what was then part of the Ottoman Empire becomes centers of Jewish life. Jews in Eastern Europe today, in this period, are mostly speaking Yiddish. Even in Central Europe, they speak Yiddish. In the Ottoman Empire, in the Arabic areas of the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Jews are speaking Jewish Arabic. In the European and Turkish areas of the Ottoman Empire, they're speaking Ladino. And so there are many Jewish communities also in other places. There's Jewish communities in Western Europe, in Southern Europe, Jewish communities now in Central Asia, in the Americas, now that the Americas are growing. There's also at this time a huge increase in the study of Kabbalah and its practices become more mainstreamed in Jewish life thanks to great scholars like Kabbalistic scholars in the 1500s, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero and the Arizal. In the 1700s, the Baal Shem Tov begins the Hasidic movement in Ukraine in the early 1700s. There's an increase in yeshivas, in schools, all over. Every Jewish community has schools. There's a great increase in scholarship, in Jewish study. Schools with time become more structured as we move into a more modern period where communities become more organized, schools become very structured. Jews also throughout this period suffer anti-Jewish pogroms and laws, especially in Eastern Europe. But throughout much of the world, there's endless pogroms, a lot of suffering, a lot of anti-Jewish laws. Towards the very end of this period in Central and Western Europe, starting in France with the French Revolution, Jews begin Central and Western Europe to begin to be emancipated, begin to get freedoms and equality. In other places, in the Americas, in the United States, Jews are emancipated. And so Jews now have freedoms that they've never had. And so as a result, Jews also struggle with assimilation. Many Jews, assimilate into the into non-Jewish life around them. And as a result, over time, most Jews stop observing most Jewish practice. So that's the period of the Achronim. Officially, the period of the Achronim has not ever ended. So we are technically, as far as we know, still in the period of the Achronim. Yet, our period today, and again, periods change slowly. And when you're in a time of changing periods, you don't really know until afterwards. So, but practically today, there has been some major changes in Jewish life. It is likely that future historians will look back and say, no, we're already in a different period. Firstly, late 19th, early 20th century, there was a huge movement of Jews to the United States and Canada and other Western countries, England, Western Europe, Australia, South Africa, but mostly the United States, from the Russian Empire, but other places in Europe. With the Russian Revolution in 1917, communism decimated Jewish life in the Soviet Union, which was the largest Jewish community at the time. A couple decades later, the Holocaust decimated Jewish life in the rest of Europe. The creation of Israel in 1948 led to the expulsion of Jews from all Muslim countries, and it decimated Jewish communities in the Middle East. Today, the largest Jewish communities by far, and this is already for some 70 years, are in Israel and in the United States, with many other communities almost everywhere in the world. Information and the ability to study has exploded. First, thanks to modern printing methods, made printing much cheaper. And so anyone can buy books, and books became widely available. Today, with the internet, of course, we've seen this huge explosion of information and access to that information. Anyone can access that information. So while we're not officially in a new period, in hindsight, likely we will be. How long a period lasts and what will happen in the future, nobody knows. We're not right. Nobody can predict the future. And of course, we Jews believe that there is an end to Jewish history. We do believe that Jewish history will end with the coming of Mashiach. We don't believe in an eternal, that we will just go on forever, but we do believe it will end with the coming of Mashiach. And we pray for Mashiach to come and hope for his coming very soon. And with that, that will then finalize, right? The end Jewish, usher in a new period, but it will be a totally different type of period with the coming. We've done a class about what the coming of Mashiach means and what life will be like in the future times, at least what we know about it. We may be without the coming of Mashiach in a new period, but regardless, it's important to understand these different periods without a real good understanding of the periods. The biblical period that ended around the year 300 BCE, the Tanaic period that ended around the year 200, with the creation of the Mishnah and the movement of Jews to Babylon, the Amoraic period, when the Talmud was written, that ended around the year 600, the Gaonic period that ended around the year 1000, the Rishonim period that ended around the year 1500, and then the Achronim period. It's important to know as we go through, as we speak of different events, different people, different things that happened, it's important to know when it was. Where did Jews live at the time? What language did they speak? Who were they living amongst, right? It's important to know where and when it was and understand which period each thing happened in. So I thank you for joining. Thank you again. Thank you again, Alfonso and Liz are not here for sponsoring, and we definitely need sponsors going forward. So if anyone would like to sponsor, it would be greatly appreciated. Next week, I will not be here because we're doing a haircutting party for my son who is 3 years old. I hope to have a guest speaker. So I'm just trying to confirm. I haven't been able to confirm the guest speaker. I'm almost there, but as soon as I have, I will let you know. But we will, God willing, have a class here at 9:30 with somebody else. I won't be me. I might just come in to say hi, but then I'm going to go prepare for my son's party. And